Um, so yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Ramatulai. I think it's really helpful to kind of locate this conversation within the 2020 project, which I guess I sort of also think about within the context of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, and the sort of, amplified racial justice demands of the BLM movement, which really kind of held everyone to account, including, many of our institutions were having to think about reflectively, actually, how are we operating, and how do we kind of address some of these concerns beyond the black square, as it were. So yeah, these kind of multi-pronged aims, I guess, of the 2020 project were around diversifying collections and who's represented in collections, as well as sort of instigating or encouraging decolonial discourse within collections. And so, yeah, I guess within this space, within the sort of programme, which is titled Reflections, I thought it would be an interesting space to kind of think about some of those questions about what it means to do that sort of work within arts and heritage collections effectively, and to sort of reflect a bit on some of my ways of working, and do that also with other people, to kind of reflect about your ways of working or other things that you've seen that you think have been effective or less effective. And so, yeah, I invited in some sort of fellow travellers, Wanja Kimani, who's an artist and curator, and who I crossed paths with first, I think about a year ago, in your role at the Fitzwilliam Museum. And there are some overlaps maybe in terms of some of the material that we were looking at within the Manchester Art Gallery project, which some of which came from Cambridge University's archives, and in some of the approaches as well, I think, to kind of thinking through material within recent exhibition that you were working on, Rise Up, which this is the publication for, and there's another one in the room as well if anyone wants to have a flick through. And also alongside Matthew Stallard, who, as mentioned, is a researcher at UCL, and is maybe one half of the sort of lead team for Global Threads, an initiative between UCL and the Science and Industry Museum, looking at kind of centering histories of enslavement alongside or in dialogue with Manchester's industrial kind of history. And I've worked really closely with Matt on the project in Manchester, kind of to think about expanding and collate research that can then inform the work that I was commissioned to do. So yeah, wanted to reflect with these guys and with all of you as well. So thank you for coming, and do get involved in the conversation when we sort of open up. So we came up with a few kind of initial prompts that we thought we could respond to, and that we in the space might respond to as well. So what forms might creative reparative work in cultural and heritage institutions take? So I guess I'm really thinking, as an artist, what can the artwork do? And what can the artist do? What can both of those things be expected to do? What are the limitations of the artist or artwork? And what do I expect of myself as well? And the second point there is, how might the way such projects are structured reflect decolonial aims? And then what happens next? So I think they all overlap, but I'll speak mainly in reverse to the first question, and then that they overlap, but Matt and Wanja might speak more to the other 2 points, and then we'll open up to all. So I guess to kind of speak a little bit about my practice, I have quite cross-disciplinary practice. It's rooted in print or printmaking as a discipline. So I'm really interested in sort of duplication, trace, dissemination, and a real interest in sort of storytelling as a means of remembering, and in sort of how individual memory joins together to kind of form collective memory or histories, and how that's really malleable. I've got an interest in sort of like careful approaches to working with matter that's documentary or fragmentary in nature. I work a lot with archival material, museum collections. And I've done a lot of work previously that's looked at sort of maybe particular, sometimes localized or site responsive social histories that are in dialogue with wider colonial histories, particularly, I guess, certain histories that operate within what Christina Sharp frames as the wake of slavery. So whether that's like, for example, working with thinking about white supremacist racial violence in Southeast London in the early 90s, which one of my kind of ongoing research strands does think about, or thinking about sugar and slavery in relation to British culinary culture for a commission in a gallery cafe, which kind of took its starting point from some porcelain objects at the V&A's collection. So yeah, I'm interested in thinking about what it means to cultivate a decolonial practice, or creative practice, something that might be like quite attuned and close looking, something that's critical or responsive, that questions or operates in dialogue, something that's maybe disruptive or resistant in some way, and that sort of undoes some of the assumed colonial logics within collections. Something that surfaces, uncovers, or amplifies quieter strands of narrative, whether that's of sort of narratives of exploitation or of joy and resistance. Something that's maybe like polyvocal or that is multi-stranded in dialogue with others, so pushing against a singular or dominant narrative, both in terms of like citation or quotation, so kind of thinking about the reference points within the work, or thinking about the hands that contribute to making a project, to making work, and the voices that are present, or the labour that's invested or utilised. I'm interested in like starting to think through more actually ideas about kind of reactivation or liveness, and like thinking about how that like might push back against a sort of inertness of the museum, or a sort of ossifying, or something that sort of tends towards a historicising without acknowledging those resonances in the present. So how do you kind of create that sort of liveness? Yeah. And I guess thinking about, as an extension of that, maybe some more embodied practices that centre the body. Thinking about work that sort of asserts the humanity of groups of people who've been objectified, and those might come about through really different methods, from like naming to highlighting, or what Saidia Hartman terms as critical fabulation, so kind of speculating into the gaps. And also thinking about, I guess, a decolonial practice as something that looks like outwards and beyond the art object, beyond the sort of maybe immediate project remit, and beyond gallery walls and across timelines as well. And I think all of these are kind of reparative measures when we think about like what is a reparative approach, what is connected to repair, recognition, compensation. So yeah, I guess I'm always thinking about these different strands within the work. So these are meant to be really short introductions, so I'll kind of whiz through as much as possible. I'm on slide 2 currently. But I will just talk really briefly about, more specifically about the Manchester Art Gallery commission. And so my proposal, I think I started working on the project, now 2 years ago. with a 15-month residency to develop new work in response to textile and costume collections at Manchester Art Gallery and Platt Hall, which is the partner gallery where the collections are held. And the proposed title of my project was The Walk, the Weft, the Wake. That's something that's stuck. And it sort of draws on two kind of quotes, if you like. So that are both up here. So on cultural theorist Christina Sharp's framing of the wake as aftermath, mourning, alertness, and also on words spoken by African-American abolitionist Sarah Parker Remond, who visited Manchester and spoke at the site that's now part of Manchester Art Gallery as part of a tour of Britain in 1859. And I wanted to think about these as a starting point for considering legacies of expansionism, colonialism, exploitative labour inherent to the material history of cotton. And yeah, I guess when I was kind of preparing this intro, I was also thinking about these two individuals in relation to the shaping and framing of decolonial practice and what that might look like. So yeah, wake work, Sharp talks about as this like sort of careful, attentive work of listening closely between the gaps, breathing life back into the archive, sort of highlighting the individual agency of the oppressed. She talks about black redaction, black annotation, these protective and reparative gestures. And then I was thinking about Sarah Parker Remond as well, as this external critical voice, which was coming into the Manchester Athenaeum, which was essentially a kind of members club, is a form of institutional critique in very literal terms, and kind of speaking about the direct lived experience of the enslaved in America. And I was really wanting to kind of channel both of these strands, channel these voices, if you like, into the space of the gallery. So yeah, I was wanting to think about these histories of cotton locally and globally, in dialogue with the costume collection, which resides at their partner gallery, as mentioned, and then thinking about these objects in connection to the industry that fueled the city, its growth, and its wealth, and also in many ways then like undergirds the institution as well. And I wanted to think carefully about histories of sight. So speaking back to these histories of place with reference to the Athenaeum, the Speakers' Hall, and to the Royal Manchester Institution, which was funded by city merchants and industry owners, and to that's hard, the Athenaeum actually, and then also to Platt Hall, which was built by a textile merchant. And for reference, the Athenaeum and the Royal Manchester Institution sit side by side, or historically sat side by side, and now the two buildings form part of they form what is now Manchester Art Gallery. So yeah, I looked at a huge amount of objects, but I was really drawn to these pattern books, which were unaccessioned. So they were sort of at the peripheries of the gallery's collection. And as mentioned, I've got this background in print, so I was it offered quite a material way in. I had a lot of, these are some more of the pattern books. And I was having conversations with a lot of people. So I guess going back to that sort of multiple voices being part of a project, I hosted a number of craft and oral history workshops with local people who were already engaged in the organisation's work. So thinking about material from a very everyday personal perspective, and use that as a way into thinking about the histories of the material, and then also to think about the experience of being in the gallery. I worked with Global Threads, as aforementioned. This is a picture of the team who worked on the Walk, the Weft, the Wake, some of whom are in the room. So this was kind of, thinking about three areas of study. that could underpin the work. So Ella Sinclair, who's just over there, was looking at the Athenaeum and what was happening in that space where Sarah Parker Remond delivered that speech at that time in that year, kind of mapping what else was taking place. So, for example, there were bankruptcy courts held at the time, linking to the Manchester cotton famine. And the other two strands of research were kind of thinking about individuals who were either kind of founding subscribers of the Royal Manchester Institution, the forerunner of the gallery, or on the first board of the Athenaeum, so the building just next door. So kind of both of these being key to the establishment of Manchester Art Gallery as we know it today. And the idea, I guess, was to use these as a way into kind of identifying some of the connections between these names and exploitative or enslaved labour. So Destiny Reynolds looked at McConnell and Kennedy, William McConnell, who was on the Athenaeum board, McConnell and Kennedy being a big fabric manufacturer. And we sort of traced links between Edisto Island in the US and Destiny was looking at kind of mapping what the lives of enslaved people and recently enslaved or formerly enslaved people looked like there. And Serena Robinson was looking at Hillsborough Estate in Dominica, which was a plantation owned by the Gregg family, who were huge donors to Manchester Art Gallery. And there's a really interesting link there between this inventory, which is held in Cambridge, which we actually asked to borrow for the exhibition, but weren't able to. We got a copy of it, and that then was actually shown in the exhibition at the Fitzwilliam. So really interesting sort of like overlaps there. Yeah, I guess alongside those different collaborations, I also worked with my mum, who used to be a costumier. So there was something there that I was thinking about around like skill sharing, sort of like cross-generational, like haptic knowledge as well. And yeah, which was really special. So the outcomes of research were that I was working towards. Sorry, these are these are some of the logbooks which have some of the names of the subscribers, the sort of funders that I sort of mentioned just a moment ago, and that's the Hillsborough estate inventory, the first page of it. So I was working towards a costume, or the sort of like the shape of the work shifted over time, but the form it ended up taking was this costume and a museum tour style work, which is to come through kind of performance. And yeah, the costume sort of took on the silhouette of one worn by Sarah Parker Remond. And it drew upon like other elements that I was looking at in the collection. So the pattern books, again, they kind of became really important. And these samples of woven check, actually, as opposed to printed cotton, which was mainly what was in the books, became really central to the work. So through conversations with Matt, actually, we identified these as fairly rare surviving examples of Manchester check or guinea cloth, which was a cheaply produced cloth often for sale to West African markets and exchange for goods, including enslaved people. And I was really interested in like this, how this material could kind of so concisely tell this story. It also raised these questions around like cataloguing, accessioning. How do we know where these things are kept? These were all very much like on the peripheries of the collection. Nobody had identified them, and nobody knew they were there. So actually, the project has been quite illuminating in that respect. So these checks found their way into the work, and I was kind of thinking about them alongside the grid in these logbooks as well, the RMI logbooks, and thinking about this idea of actually whose money was assigned to the founding of the institution, and whose names are not included. So these are end papers from the logbooks, which also became part of the design. And this is one of the labels on the front of one of those logbooks. So I was really interested in this idea of assent or consent, who has assented and who hasn't had that opportunity. And like this idea of like the name, which I think I mentioned briefly at the beginning, is again really interesting, in terms of like when we're looking at documentation that we might have as a trace of the lives of enslaved people, it's in a really kind of deeply objectifying capacity. So they might be like accounting records or just absences altogether. And in the Hillsborough document instance, that's an inventory. So it's a list of enslaved people on the plantation alongside a list of objects like tables and farm materials. And so, how do we then deal with these actually quite violent documents when they do tell us something about individuals, but they are kind of really problematic. And yeah, there was a great talk actually that Matt invited me to through the Centre for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery, by Professor Alex Gill, on the humanity and inhumanity of data, which kind of spoke a lot about that, like how do we address that sort of material. And yeah, I guess when I was thinking about that within the project, there was the idea of like, do I start inserting some of these names into the costume, or actually the sort of decision in the end was to leave that space of the grid as this like potential space to be kind of activated. So it became a lot looser, but in the space we curated a collection of objects that I'd been looking at over the course of the project in the space. And one of the things that we did was I invited the researchers to read the names of these primary sources, if you like, or read the primary sources. So Serena read many of the names on the Hillsborough records. And it was really interesting to visit the Fitzwilliam Museum's exhibition and see like quite a similar approach, actually, this kind of reading of names to amplify or to kind of honour the lives of these individuals. And I know that's also those sort of methodologies of naming or bringing kind of making space for the name are not uncommon in creative practice. I think it's a really interesting one. So I guess beyond these are all images that I meant to talk about. This is my mum in the studio. And these are some images from the exhibition. So like the staging of the exhibition is also felt quite important, with the costume in the middle and the archival material and museum collection material around the edges, around the peripheries, that they can be sort of dipped in and out of and directly speak to each other. And there is a plan for the performance to occur at some point. It's a kind of work in progress and very dependent on funding, but it's an ongoing conversation and something that Manchester Art Gallery have expressed a desire to kind of support. And we've also been kind of speaking about how we kind of programme events that initiate further dialogue around the exhibition and bring to life that research. So Matt and I have been working closely with the Manchester Art Gallery team on sort of trying to make some of that happen later this year. So there is a sort of ongoing relationship there. And I'm getting towards wrapping up, but I guess I just wanted to sort of kind of think about how the project, it borrows from these like strategies of institutional critique in sort of speaking back to histories of sight. So particularly, I guess, with the tour, the plans for the tour, I was thinking a lot about Andrea Fraser's museum highlights, for example, or like even in the kind of curation, thinking about Fred Wilson's Mining the Museums. Or more recently, actually, really interesting to see like Hugh Locke's approach at the British Museum to kind of interpretation. And we spoke a lot about interpretation, kind of trying to think about the different voices that are included in that process. And I was thinking also about, again, more recently, an artist, Ima Abasio-Collins' practice, which has this sort of institutional critique thread to it in kind of exposing and probing out some of the mechanisms of labour and exchange in cultural institutions, and sort of thinking about the wider conditions that work sits within. So, for example, some of the work that she made was developing a series of dishwasher tablets for the showroom, for a show at the showroom, where she drew up a contract with the gallery where they had to exclusively buy dishwasher tablets from her for the foreseeable future. So she was kind of thinking about what is a relationship, an ongoing relationship, and away from this idea of like a one-off project, like what does it mean to establish an ongoing dialogue or a commitment to a sort of discourse? And in other work, we worked together when I was working at Turf Projects many years ago, and we commissioned Ima. Ima invited in a collaborator, Taylor Lamel. We had a set fee, a flat exhibition fee. And so they decided to split the exhibition fee, but broke it down into a day rate, which many of you will know, if you split most exhibition fees down into a day rate, would get you about 2 days or something crazy. But they broke it down into a day rate, and they said, we're going to just work as much as the budget allows. So that includes admin, and in terms of emails to galleries, it includes our meetings, and it includes making whatever the work is. And the work that they showed, I mean, I think they did probably break the rule, to be honest, but the work that they showed, they called it a draft as opposed to an exhibition. So, and I think one of the things they said that actually, because it was a project space, it kind of facilitated that sort of, experimentation. But I thought that was really interesting. These kind of acts that like push against the boundaries, like probe the boundaries of like, what is the institution? How is it set up? And how might it function? And yeah, I was really interested to come across, there's an article that Morgan Quaintance, sort of writer, curator, artist, wrote quite a few years back now, called The New Conservatism on Efflux, where he talks about the sort of compromising dynamics of funding, private funding in the arts. And within that context, he calls institutional critique as a practice a toothless practice, which is pretty damning. But I think it's some useful food for thought, or a provocation, like what next? Like, what do we do to ensure it's not just sort of insular, slightly navel-gazing exercise? And while I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Sarah Parker Remond with her famous quote, "When I walk through the streets of Manchester and see load after load of cotton." She's really bringing the outside into the institution, and speaking back to the institution in itself, an institution that was made up of many people who were generating their wealth from cotton. And that also made me think about Jasleen Kerr's recent speech at the Turner Prize award event, where she sort of called for a porousness of the inside and outside. Where she was amplifying demands for Tate to cut ties with institutions complicit in with Israel in the context of its settler colonialist ambitions and genocide of the Palestinian people. And there was a protest outside that was calling for this. And she said, "I've been wondering why artists are required to dream up liberation in the gallery, but when that dream meets life, we are shut down. I want the separation between the expression of politics in the gallery and the practice of politics in life to disappear. I want the institution to understand that if you want us inside, you need to listen to us outside. And she goes on to call for a proper ceasefire now, arms embargo now, free Palestine. And I was thinking about, like what it means, for something to feel succinct or contained within the gallery, which actually is quite, and for that to kind of leak out, actually. So quite opposed to maybe this modernist ideal of an autonomous artwork that is self-contained and only speaks to itself and on its own terms. She also talks about, I think in the speech, she also referenced the Sacklers and Nan Golding's pain campaign, which threw the Sacklers' involvement in the opioid crisis into sharp relief. So how does the work connect with our wider politics outside and beyond? I think a lot of us, a lot of artists, a lot of creatives have been kind of really challenged in recent years to reflect very deeply on our politics, like throughout the work that we're doing. Who's funding the project? Like, how is the project framed? So I guess if the Manchester work begins to probe at the wealth that is kind of underscored the funding of the art gallery, the founding of the art gallery, then who are the current founders and funders that are propping up our current arts infrastructure? How do we think about that? How does it extend to our wider working practices and how a project is built or conceived of in the first place? And how a project or an artwork might extend beyond permeable walls and across time. So that's my little provocation, which I will then hand over to Wanja yes.
It's been less than 2 weeks since I left the museum, so I think the title of my presentation was a bit kind of premature. But I wanted to think about kind of my work within the Fitzwilliam Museum, and then maybe have some thought about beyond as well. So I started working on a fixed term contract in October 2022 as exhibition project curator for what became Black Atlantic, but it was originally titled Cambridge and Slavery, but we reworded that. And I was tasked with introducing more contemporary art because at that point the exhibitionist was kind of quite developed. And it was largely historical objects from the 8 University of Cambridge museums, and then there were some international loads as well. And the exhibition took place in the 5 founders galleries. For anyone that hasn't been to the museum, there's this. So this is the original kind of building, and then the temporary exhibition space was kind of built after. And this was going to be the first temporary exhibition in the Founders Galleries, which up until that point had only kind of housed the permanent collection. So it was seen as a kind of intentional disruption of that space. And the exhibition explored the period leading up to and until the height of the transatlantic slave trade, drawing on objects from, like I said, the kind of 8 University of Cambridge museums and some international loans as well. And we were interested in how portraiture can kind of tell stories, how we know about some people and less so about others. So that was the kind of the initial point of entry for the exhibition. And we wove contemporary art throughout the exhibition. So in this example, we've got Keith Piper's The Colored Codex, which looks at how skin color was a kind of signifier of status and during enslavement, but then also connects to colorism, which is continues to be a global issue. And next to this, we had Richard Waller's Table of Colors, which is one example of historical kind of racist science. So the only part of the chart that that kind of used racialized language was with the darker tones, and which was used to kind of categorize people based on their skin tone, and claim kind of black inferiority. I'm sorry. And you can see that's from 1686. So we're placing contemporary art alongside these objects to kind of show the legacy of these kinds of kind of knowledge that was being produced and disseminated through the museum. And the exhibition was cyclical. So we explored the depiction of Black people from this early example of which showed like a high status figure. So this is one of the earliest kind of depictions of a Black figure in Western painting. And we ended with this contemporary self-portrait of by Alexis Peskin, which was at the end of the exhibition. So we kind of started with this portrait of a man in a red suit, which is a figure that still kind of the story remains unknown, and then ended with this, which is a self-portrait. So when I first started, the exhibition was going to be one kind of large exhibition. And then as the kind of list of objects grew and more contemporary art was kind of proposed by me, they realized that it was kind of outgrowing the space. So it was divided into two. So Rise Up was the kind of second part, but a standalone show in itself. And this was largely looking at the kind of resistance to enslavement. So in the first exhibition, there was quite a lot of kind of apprehension towards the contemporary art because I was working with historians, and traditionally the museum was very much this happened and then this happened. So it was kind of linear, whereas I was kind of trying to break that to kind of return it back to the now. So it went down, it was a difficult kind of sell. But for the second exhibition, because of the success of the first, it was easy to kind of inject some more contemporary work in. So in this one, we had kind of more contemporary work by artists kind of mid to kind of early career to like mid-career. So we had like a range of artists showing as well. So this is Julian again, and this was kind of his depiction of kind of returnees from the slave ships. And this was a piece by Karen McLean, who was also part of 2020. And then that was a trio of prints by Jocelyn Gardner as well, kind of looking at how women use their own bodies as sites of resistance. So kind of using botanical knowledge, they could then kind of induce their own abortions and kind of have some autonomy over their own bodies. So we used more contemporary work to explore different sites of resistance. So in this section, it was Haiti. And I end with this work, which was the final piece in the exhibition by Genevieve Innes. And I wanted to end here because I objected to its kind of placing here, because this final section was called Moving Forward. And as strong as the work is, I felt, and like how monumental it is, it kind of really took up a lot of space, and it became a point of kind of real conversation at the end of the exhibition. So it served an amazing purpose. But for me, I felt like it was kind of letting off the institution, because this is a work by a young Black artist, and she's kind of, it's like her responsibility to then still teach, whereas the show should also be a time for the institution to reflect about what they need to do. It shouldn't just be about Black labour kind of driving these conversations and this change as well. And there's kind of so much more I could say, some of which I wrote in an essay in the catalogue, which you'll free to kind of look at. And I can share with anyone that wants a copy as well. But the essay is kind of like the only marker that I was there. Like that's the only thing that I can almost take away with me from my time there. And that's for me, like part of the nature of this work when it's temporary and it's fixed term, you know, things to come and go, like projects do their job and then like the institution kind of remains. And I really question the structure of these kind of projects when it comes to kind of so-called reparative justice and when it comes to seeing these projects as doing some of that work because it is so temporary. And when you were talking about the loan of the Hillsborough inventory, like since 2020, so many institutions have been kind of putting on these exhibitions. So all of these objects are like in high demand. And then what will happen when it goes quiet again? Like they'll go back and we might not see them for another 13 years or however long until the institutions then want to do this work again. So I'm no longer there. I've been out for 2 weeks and I'm really kind of thinking about ways of kind of longevity beyond what is kind of provided by the institutions. And I'm still thinking and still kind of formulating. But yeah, just wanted to thank you. Coaching.
So yeah, we chatted, was it last week or the week before, about what the theme of these reflections and discussions were going to be. And I feel like I just kind of brain dumped on you guys in the hope that then by this week I've worked out what I was actually thought. But I think I'm still just in the process of brain dumping. But hopefully this is the good space to kind of see where those things come together. And like, I was writing down some of what you were saying, Holly. But the chair of our Centre for the Study of the Legacy of British Slavery at UCL, Catherine Hall, she talks about the concept of reparatory history. And that's a kind of, I guess, that's the inspiration or the kind of provocation that we kind of constantly trying to think about what it actually would mean in terms of practice, in terms of the way that we do public history. And the Global Threads Project work with numerous institutions. So this is kind of my slow processing and trying to work out like what is it that we are actually trying to do. But it's very much a work in progress, I think. But the Global Threads kind of platform came out of discussions with the Science and Industry Museum beginning in kind of 2019 with Katie Belshaw, who's the senior curator there for industrial heritage. And they were very keen to embed and start to develop much greater engagement with histories of colonization and enslavement and Manchester's kind of global connections as the first industrial city anywhere in the world. So the kind of core questions we started out with were these stories about embedding the global narratives and narratives around the stage when enslavement into the core narrative of Manchester's history, not in this kind of detached corner of the gallery or corner of the story. Very much thinking about how can we draw out lived experiences of people who are actually impacted by enslavement, particularly centering resistance. How do we look like, as you were saying, Holly, how do we bring in diverse perspectives rather than trying to tell a kind of one track, single author or single story? How do we work in an equitable and reparatory way in terms of who does it, how we do it? And then, begin to think about making these things, these histories relatable to audiences. So the Global Threads way of working, and we've got two of our current Global Threads team here as well. This is exciting. But if I get it wrong, you'll obviously tell everyone what really happens. I think one of the core ways of trying to think about how do we tell these stories and do this research in a reparatory practice is to try and move out of the traditional whether it's academic or kind of curatorial way of thinking, where you kind of have one important person leading the work. Often, the funding follows the big name or the kind of lead academic on a project. So obviously we were trying to think, well, the opposite of that would be to have numerous voices and numerous perspectives around every piece of work that we do. So we started off, we recruited a team of 7 early career researchers, all at that kind of master's or just after master's level, which, as well as kind of thinking about how to bring people in who are from different disciplinary backgrounds. So not just a lot of historians, but people who could bring different ways of research, but also within the kind of pipeline into careers in research or into museums and galleries and curation. That gap between masters and postgraduate or your first professional job is often the spot where a lot of people will struggle to get into those industries. So this is a kind of fully paid kind of small commissions to all of the people on the project, so that you can actually get paid to get experience working in public history, heritage, cultural sector, and research as well. And the way we worked with them was to give them a whole world's worth of connections. The only kind of thing we said to them was we need some kind of connection to Manchester in the stories that you're looking at. Could be a place, could be a person, could be a financial legacy, it could be commodities. And obviously that kind of thinking about how do we center stories of colonization, of resistance, of solidarity. And this was the first 10 that team came up with themselves. They had to pitch them to us to get their commissions, and then we worked with them all. And the team worked collaboratively, but we also had a kind of one-to-one coaching and mentoring. And that then, those kind of that full range of stories that went across the Atlantic to North America, to the Caribbean, to South Asia, and looking at migration within Manchester and Lancashire as well. So the way we also set these micro commissions up, again, trying to think about a kind of decolonial practice. Often when institutions are doing this kind of work, and we've seen, as you said, many institutions since George Floyd's 2020 kind of feeling the pressure to do something. You often find you get these commissions where an academic or a researcher will come in and write a report. Right, the institutions love a report, don't they? Can we just, in X amount of time, can one person come in, find out where all the bodies are buried, find out all the bad stuff, write it all up in a report, publish that, done. So we were kind of very much thinking about, well, we know that this work is not work that it can just be one and done. This is something that actually needs to be a constant, continuing process. How can you possibly tell a global story of so many different perspectives in one project? So each of those case studies is usually about 1,000, 1,500 words long. And we specifically asked the team to look for images or objects that can help tell stories. Specifically look for kind of primary sources that can reveal information about the lives of people that, otherwise hasn't been kind of platformed. But also we write them in a kind of informative, academic or almost academic style, but with the full intention that they become the raw materials for engagement work, kind of community-based work. So this was in our second year, we got funding then to go and actually try out a whole series of engagement activities based off the research that the team had done, which we brought in an electro-knitting expert into the museum who created this. This banner was made by about 100 people across a day, each knitting a few lines of the stitching. Also, by taking that kind of approach of kind of very neat kind of human-sized stories that think about objects and sources, they are able to then be like the raw material for new kind of permanent exhibition installations within the Science and Industry Museum. So they were, within a year or two, actually able to begin that process of updating the actual permanent interpretation of materials in the gallery. But then we've continued. So the museum then is built on those engagement activities, and we're able to actually get 18 months worth of engagement funding to actually build a package of community relationships around that work. But also now in 2027, there's going to be a big exhibition in partnership with The Guardian at the museum, which we've just commissioned another 7 studies, which again, some of the people here today will be involved with, to start threading out more of these stories. And I use this metaphor, which the Global Threads people will have heard many times, which is the reason why we call it Global Threads is because thinking about Manchester and its textile history, the way in which we can tell that holistic global story is through hundreds of individual threads that over time, written by however many people we possibly can, you weave together to tell a larger, a richer, a more holistic, but kind of never quite finished or completed story. So that kind of resistance to production and kind of completeness, and really pushing towards the fact that this is a process that we will keep doing, and we'll keep bringing in new researchers, hopefully, keep partnering with new institutions, and kind of almost thinking a lot about these institutions and the difficulties that the institutions have. I don't know, I guess a lot of us probably don't have a huge amount of sympathy for institutions, particularly when you work in them and you're dealing with the bureaucracy of the day-to-day, or you're trying to influence changes in practices. But I don't know, we've worked since the Science and Industry initial phase with Blackburn Museum and Gallery on an exhibition project where we've commissioned 4 new studies alongside the exhibition. These were the 3 new studies that came about in the Manchester Art Gallery collaboration with Holly, and that's some of the materials there. And then currently Ella and Ginevra are working with the Portico Library in Manchester, which, similarly to Manchester Art Gallery, is one of these members clubs that was founded by a small elite group of oligarchs funded by the cotton economy and the transatlantic economy. And all of these institutions, they're kind of, they know they need to do something. And I guess one response to finding out about how these institutions have been built and they've been funded and what they were actually there for, one response would be, well, you could just if they're so toxic, these places, we could just knock them all down, right? We could sell off the collections, split it out as reparations or community funding and start again. But I mean, the fact that we're all working in those institutions or with those institutions or visiting those institutions, obviously there's something. I've worked for many years in a small local charity with no infrastructure, and really appreciate, even when you're in the most frustrating big institution, the power of having an infrastructure behind you. But then, so I don't really have an answer to this, but maybe this is the open question we're all trying to get at, is what are those external spaces of innovation, or maybe it's even more about accountability, that actually how does some of that investment that would usually go into production, into just making new work or putting on new shows, how do you divert more of that into the kind of care and maintenance of these kind of open, creative spaces? Manchester has this new cultural strategy where they talk about cultural democracy. But when you read the strategy, it sounds a little bit like we're going to put on shows for different audiences in order to get them to come into our space. But I do think this idea of cultural democracy is interesting if you try and think about, well, what is the investment that continues that's kind of adjacent to or outside of the institutions, that almost, with the best will in the world, it's really difficult within an institution to do things that are risky or different, or that kind of push against those kind of rationalizing, colonizing institutional frameworks. So yeah, I don't really have the answer, but trying to kind of work outside as that critical friend, and I don't know, make that into a continual conversation and process rather than that stop-start. And kind of, one and done approach. Maybe there's something there. I feel a lot of pressure now as well. I have to have a point.
No, that's really, really great. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Wanja. I spoke for absolutely ages, so I'm really sorry we don't have loads of time, but I'd love to open it up into more of a kind of discussion with everyone.